So, hello everyone. Welcome to Earth Central, the podcast where we invite sustainability experts to talk about sustainability subjects such as carbon credits. Today, we have with us Elias Ayrey, who is working in Renoster, and he's here to talk with us about the topics of carbon markets. So, Elias, if you would like to give us a small introduction about yourself and what you do in this company and what is your missions and goals, that would be amazing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name's Elias. I'm Chief Science Officer at Renoster, and Renoster is a carbon ratings agency. So what we basically do is we provide diligence for carbon projects to ensure that the carbon credits that they're claiming are genuine, that removals are actually taking place, or that people are actually getting paid who should be getting paid. My personal background is in forest science, so I have a PhD in the subject, primarily focused in remote sensing. And then I guess on the side, I personally am a bit of an advocate or a troublemaker in the carbon industry because I tend to speak out when I see things that I think are wrong in the industry.
So I guess probably we have a lot of things to discuss because I'm sure there are many things that are wrong, but we are here to fix them. I would like to know how you got motivated to work in that field and how you got actually motivated to work with Renoster. What were the key gaps in the carbon markets and what was the key idea that gave you the hint to start this business and to be involved there?
Yeah, so I guess I should say I am a co-founder of Renoster, and I've been in the carbon industry for, I guess, a little over 5 years now. And initially, I was working for a large carbon broker. So we were reselling carbon credits. And frankly, we were happy to admit at the time that most of the carbon credits that we were looking at and reselling weren't meeting our criteria. They weren't good enough for resale. And this was quite upsetting, right? Because obviously, I consider myself a climate scientist. I got into this space so that I could have a large climate impact, and to see a lot of carbon credits that don't really seem to be having any sort of impact really made me ask, what am I doing with my life? And so, I left that brokerage, I guess, about 2.5 years ago, and I co-founded Renoster back then because I really saw what was missing in the industry was just a knowledge gap. People weren't really aware which projects were good and which ones were bad. They saw a lot of fluffy PR from all the projects, and they weren't really able to hone in on the ones that were really doing good work. And so my hope was and still is that if we tell people which projects are great, the market will naturally drift towards those, and the projects that aren't so great will kind of be left out and not considered as much.
And in that process, what was the main key challenge? Because I also understand that by kind of going against that and actually expressing your opinions that way, maybe some people react negatively to that. And by being a co-founder, that also means you have to be kind of aware about PR. So I would like to know what was the main key challenge on that?
Well, yeah, that's definitely a challenge, and that was always a challenge at the brokerage. Was that if you speak out too negatively about the industry, because it's a very tight knit industry that is very cliquish, I would say, uh, you can get blacklisted. And I think that our company has, from day one, just uh, pledged not to do that. We don't speak in PR terms. We will tell you the honest truth about these projects, good or bad. And honestly, that has, of course, accumulated a lot of enemies in the carbon market, and that's always challenging because if you have a project developer saying, like, these guys are awful, then that's always difficult to work in. But the customers that we do have, I think, are very appreciative of, like, the very straightforward talk that we provide them. We provide very clear descriptions of what we're seeing. We provide very clear ratings that are numeric. And so there's not really any wiggle room in our findings, which I think is kind of a breath of fresh air for a lot of people in the carbon industry.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so now you're talking about the present. What about the future? What is the vision that you have for your company? What is the main goal you want to achieve in the next, let's say, 5 years? And it's not about just carbon markets and how they're going to evolve, but like you personally working there, what you want to achieve.
Well, I guess what we really envision is cleaning up the carbon markets. And I mean, this sounds deeply vain, of course, but we really want the carbon markets to work. And we don't feel that they're working particularly well right now. And I think that that's kind of echoed in a lot of the sentiment in the market right now. And so what our ideal would be that we're providing diligence and providing thought leadership as one little piece of a larger push to fix the carbon markets and, I guess get a lot of these bad projects off the markets and create really ironclad protocols that are unmanipulatable and really unquestionable. We are real strong believers that carbon credits are kind of one of the only solutions out there that we realistically have. And that, I think, comes from a deep cynicism for most people at the team, which is that we don't think that like humans are necessarily on track to meet all of their emissions targets. And we don't think that many people are willing to make massive personal changes to their lifestyle in order to meet human emissions targets. I'm not. I still take vacations. I still go on airline flights and stuff. And, we think that carbon credits represent one of, if not the best option out there to, as a realistic goal of reducing our emissions as a society. So, yeah.
Do you think this is also because of the monetization? Because I was talking with a prospect client last week, and he was telling me that the thing that he believes that carbon markets are actually working is because they're monetized. Do you think that this is the reason why carbon markets may also work?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big believer in the free market, and I think that nobody who buys these carbon credits wants to buy bad ones. That's just a universal rule. And so people are often kind of like poking their fingers at the groups who are buying these credits and saying like, oh, you didn't do a great job. But I mean, they kind of got duped. I think that at the end of the day, there are real market forces at play that causes everyone to want better credits. And even those who are kind of more middlemen, like the brokers and the traders in the carbon community, they still don't want to buy credits that are problematic. So I do think this is a very powerful mechanism for funding action that can incentivize fixing climate change. And if you look at other pathways to avoid deforestation or to plant trees or whatever it happens to be, they're pretty small potatoes relative to the private capital, right? Like you'd have to raise a lot of grant money in order to have a lot of really strong action at a global level. So I do think that that's why carbon credits can work. Yeah.
And what about the latest report of the Science Based Target Initiative? I'm sure you've seen it. It was all over that they actually said that they're going to postpone the decision about carbon markets and net zero. How you felt about that?
I mean, I talked to a number of consultants for SBTI, and my feeling is that carbon credits as a whole right now are on the whole untrustworthy. And I think that is, it's going to been played out by more than a dozen academic researchers at this point. And so for SBTI to just blanketly accept all carbon credits as a great solution would be really dangerous. And so what SBTI could do is create a really rigorous set of standards around what it takes to accept a credit and what it doesn't. But they don't really seem to be willing or able to do that really tough work. And so, I do think at this point in time, it is fairly responsible for an organization as large as SBTI to kind of throw their hands up and say that, carbon credits aren't ready yet. And I hope that this is going to be one of many trigger mechanisms for the carbon industry itself to reform itself. We've been talking about this, I guess, as an industry for the past, I'd say, 2 or 3 years. And I can't say that there's been enormous amounts of reform. But I do think that the world will accept carbon credits if we go back and think about them more critically and kind of fix some of the problems that exist in them.
Right. Actually, that's a very good perspective. I haven't thought that this could work as a trigger, but you're actually right. And we talked about the flaws of carbon markets, but I would really like to go a bit deeper there. So I would like to know from your side as an expert, what are the flaws of the current carbon markets? And I know that you can list probably quite a few, but I would like to point out the things that you think that they really need to change immediately.
Well, just last week I did put out a 25-page paper with more than 80 points of things that I would fix in the carbon market. So that's tough to go into in a podcast like this. But I would say there are highly technical flaws in which project developers can kind of manipulate the numbers to get too many credits. And these can be really technical issues like the wrong use of a model form. So if you're trying to, for example, predict how much deforestation would have happened on a project in the absence of the project, you probably don't want to use an exponential equation to say that the whole thing would have been cut down in a couple years. So those are the really technical elements. But I think at the higher level, there have generally been problems that are more related to conflicts of interest in the system. And I think one of the biggest conflicts of interest that exists in the system is that projects essentially are not verified by third parties before credits are issued. You do have to go and create a project as a developer and then hire a verifier to sign off on your work. However, you're shopping around for verifiers and you get to choose your own verifier. And obviously, verifiers have a very strong financial incentive to sign off on your work because you're the one paying them and because it takes them a lot of time and effort if they find problems with your work. So that's led to a lot of problems because I think a lot of the little nuances in the carbon markets have kind of been overlooked by these verifiers who aren't really doing any verification job. I think that we do need much stronger protocols. And, I think that protocols really need to be developed from kind of an adversarial perspective of kind of asking yourself, well, if I was, had malintent, how could I take advantage of these protocols? I think that there's a real problem right now today with where the money is going. And I think it's a fairly common statistic floating out there that 60 to 90% of revenue from carbon projects don't actually make it to the ground. We have to remember that most of these carbon projects, at least the nature-based ones that I specialize in, they are paying people to change their actions. They're paying people to stop cutting down their trees. They're paying people to stop, creating agricultural farms that have potentially been in the family for hundreds of years. And so those are the people that need to be paid. And right now in the carbon markets, there is no minimum requirement that says you must, 50% of the revenue must go to these people. There's no requirements at all, actually. Right. And so we have countless examples of these human rights violations where, land is being seized from people and they're not being adequately compensated for it. I think that there's other mechanisms that we can think about that would be really impactful. So I think that, for example, if private insurance were required for all carbon programs, there'd be a much stronger incentive for carbon projects, to get things right, because nobody's going to insure a bad project. Yeah, I guess we can refer to the list, but those are the big ones. And I think that if we just kind of rethink the system in a couple of simple ways, we can kind of fix a lot of these conflicts. So, for example, if verifications were done by third-party auditors who were basically selected at random by the registry, by Vera or by Gold Standard, and then assigned to the project and paid out of a global pool, that would remove that conflict of interest. And so, and another example, for example, if third-party auditors were, incentivized not just to audit to the rule set, but to audit to a higher set of principles, like the core carbon principles that have been put out there or Vera's own principles, that would eliminate a lot of the kind of tricky stuff that we see with the accounting numbers. It's really hard to create a rule set that everyone can agree on and is completely ungameable. But if verifiers are not just checking off the boxes of the rule set and actually trying to verify to a higher set of carbon principles, then potentially they could catch a lot of this misbehavior. Well, I guess, at the risk of getting philosophical, most of the individual people I've met in this industry are good people and are in it for the right causes. But I think most of the organizations in this industry are in it to make money. And I think that we really need to be very critical of who's looking at these projects, and we need to really create a system of checks and balances that doesn't exist today.
And what about the verifiers? What is the thing that you think they're currently missing? What components should they have in order to be better verifiers?
Well, I do think the number one thing is the conflict of interest. But if we move beyond that, I think a lot of the verifiers tend to lack the real subtle expertise to figure out what's going on inside these projects. And so a lot of them, we're all forest scientists at Renoster. We employ 6 forest scientists with PhDs. And when we go into these numbers, we're able to see the really subtle stuff that's being done in the accounting data. And I don't think that verifiers are often that expert at figuring this kind of stuff out. I also think that verifiers tend to not actually do their own diligence. So they don't have their own remote sensing teams. They're generally just taking data that the developer is giving them and kind of signing off on it. Well, the problem there is that you have to trust the underlying data to begin with. So you have to trust that the remote sensing imagery is valid, or that the plots that you're using to actually create these models are valid. So there's a crisis of trust and a crisis of I think capabilities in the verification system. Yeah, I guess the other thing that I would point out is that verifiers right now, their job is to verify whether or not the rules are being followed. And that's a really problematic point because you can have all the rules being followed and still create a really terrible project. Um, there's enough gaps in the rules that you can get away with almost anything in your accounting frameworks right now under most standards. And so we really need to shift verifiers from this kind of philosophy of like, did they check all the boxes and follow the rules to are they doing the right thing for the climate? Um,
Mm.
and I think the other bit, yeah, we get back into conflicts of interest there, where I think that I've known a lot of verifiers and they are really crunched to get these projects reviewed in a very short period of time. And oftentimes they subcontract out to other people to do this very quickly too. And they do not have an incentive themselves to find issues, because if they do find an issue, that extends the length of their verification. The money stays the same. They're still getting paid the same amount of money, but now it may take an extra 2 weeks to verify this project as you go back and forth with the developer. So there's an underlying problem right there. And I think that we can
Mm.
probably think of solutions in which verifiers are paid to find flaws in these projects, or at least given bonuses to find flaws, and in which they're kind of paid out of a global pool that all projects contribute to rather than an individual one. So I think
So,
that was like 4 big points.
so you think that actually project developers should find a different way to verify the project? I mean, because you said that it would be better if the verifiers could get paid from a global pool. Let's say that every project actually contributes, and I get that this is going to bring more transparency and objectivity to the way they're verifying. But then this pool has to be paid by the developers.
Yeah, exactly to how the buffer pool works
Okay.
today. So today, the
Okay.
buffer pool works at Vera itself, or the registry maintains a pool that's an insurance pool that all projects contribute into. And the amount of their contribution depends on how much risk there is. In this case,
Mhm.
the amount of contribution towards the verification pool that I would propose would be how much effort it takes to verify the project. And then,
Okay.
so developers would essentially have to pay a chunk into this pool, and then that pool would be used to pay verifiers independently. Um,
But then this is gonna kind of decrease the competition of verifiers, because no, but then the verifiers actually will have to compete based on the technology and the skills they have, rather than on cost effectiveness or how fast they do the things and the work. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I see your point. This is a very nice point, actually.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, we could touch on the technology, which is that I think right now verifiers, they don't employ technology at all. Like, again, like they
Oh.
just take data from the developer. But arguably, verifiers should be doing the bulk of the actual calculations of the project. We can envision a world in which developers' only role is governance, and the
Right.
verifier, it then comes in and says, using the remote sensing technology, this is how many credits the project should get. There are some cool systems out there that are really experimental, that are kind of playing around with this kind of stuff. So, for example, Open Forest Protocol is entirely prescriptive. So there's no wiggle room, and the developer doesn't come up with their own set of numbers. And there's
Hmm.
a pool of verifiers that are selected at random. And every project gets something like 10 verifiers selected. And the verifiers basically vote up or down on whether or not they like the project in a series of voting rounds. So it's definitely something that could be done. And I think there's analogs out there for how it could work.
Nice. And what about technology and remote sensing? Because you mentioned, I mean, we both kind of work in the same field and satellite data, and I would like to know some limitations that you can also spot. Can you tell me what are these limitations that you can see on the way how remote sensing can help carbon markets? And also what are the benefits of remote sensing carbon markets apart from, actually having accurate data and being transparent with that?
Well, we are, yeah, we're primarily a remote sensing company. So we do most of our validations using remote sensing, although there are a couple of exceptions when needed.
Hmm.
Remote sensing can offer very, very good unbiased estimates of how much carbon is being stored or removed by a project. And I think there's a number of techniques out there that the carbon community has kind of converged on that are really best practices for doing this. So, for example, I think a lot of the carbon community right now uses dynamic baselines using remote sensing, in which we're basically following the outcomes of a project and then identifying matches outside that project and following those outcomes over time. And the difference between what the project achieves and what the matches achieves is what is the basis for issuing carbon credits. Um, I think, the tricky thing about remote sensing, I think there are two things. The first is that, again, we have these problems potentially with conflicts of interest. So if we look at some of the biggest scandals in the industry, like Kariba, they were using remote sensing, and that was a long time ago. But the remote sensing models that they were creating were seemingly biased. They didn't seem to agree with academic, literature or whatnot. And so we still have this problem of, whoever's making the maps, the remote sensing maps, could potentially, have their thumb on the scale. And so we have to kind of, as a remote sensing community, think of ways in which we can mitigate that fact. And one really great way would be if Vera or if another large independent organization, like, I don't know, the ICBCM or something, put out global data sets that we could all validate our models off of. Because you have your models and Renoster has its models and everybody's got their own models. And who's to say which one's more right or wrong? But, those models are all driven based on internal data that we, are scrolling away for ourselves. And it would be great if, for example, Vera put out data sets that could confirm, this is how accurate your baseline is. This is how accurate your carbon stock is based on a set of global measurements that everyone had to apply their models to. So that's a really good solution that allows people to create remote sensing. It allows a competitive environment because now there's an incentive for everyone to create better models and do better on those data sets. I think another kind of issue with remote sensing is that measuring forest carbon itself can still be tricky. I think that generally speaking, in terms of remote sensing, airborne LiDAR gets you the best estimates, but we don't have airborne LiDAR over the whole world. There's a number of global satellites that do a decent job, but could do kind of worse at smaller areas. So when you go into projects that are really small, you can get higher levels of error than would be desirable. And so we still kind of, as a ratings agency, we still encourage projects to have field inventories or airborne LiDAR. And I think that, the solution to that one is just to wait, because there are some really cool remote sensing satellites that are coming online in the next year or two. NASA's NISAR satellite, the European Space Agency's Biomass satellite, and these are potentially going to be game changers. They're going to be able to tell us more about forest carbon than we know today. And I think another big, thing that they'll be able to figure out for us with remote sensing is degradation, which I think a lot of us have struggled with. If you're going in and removing, I don't know, a fifth of the trees per hectare, the fifth that are most valuable and have the most carbon, then that's a tricky thing to measure with remote sensing. So I think we're getting there, and we just need to wait another couple of years for the technology to improve a bit.
And how do you think AI is going to be implemented to these technologies?
Well, I mean, we use AI all the time, not in the sense of like a large language model, but more in the sense of like neural networks that are useful at scanning remote sensing imagery. And I think AI in the remote sensing field is a little behind other fields because it's just a smaller industry. So, for example, I think one of the cool things that we could see coming out in the next couple of years that I've heard chitter-chattering about from like the big agencies like Google and NASA and stuff are pre-trained neural networks that are trained across like vast swaths of imagery across the entire world that anybody can then take and retrain to their own purpose. So I do think that Renoster uses neural networks as a tool to estimate carbon on a fairly regular basis, and that those are only going to get better. But they're not typically the same types of AI as people think of in terms of large language models that you can kind of talk to.
Okay.
They're more the type of AI that like looks at an image of a cat and says that's a cat.
But that's also very interesting to see how technologies are getting integrated together to create something bigger. That's very nice. And because, I mean, you're a rating agency, but I would like to know, what are the main things you're taking care of when you rate a project?
Oh, we've got a bunch of criteria, so I have to rattle them off the top of my head, I guess. But so, well, I guess, there's a lot of components that are really important. And so we start by kind of asking who it is that's developing these projects. And we typically withhold this data from our public ratings because we don't want to upset people too much. But generally speaking, if your project is being developed by someone who's got a human rights report written by them, you probably want to know about that. We move on to basically governments and environment. So is the project being managed properly? Is there a team on the ground? This doesn't matter so much for tiny little projects where one farmer signed a contract, but for these projects in which there's sometimes up to 100,000 people living inside them at this point, they need a governance structure that's almost the size of like a small city or something like that. is the project legal? So, are there legal requirements around it? We look at the budget and the timeline. So, is the budget reasonable? I think one thing we're looking at is like, are the returns going to match what it costs to actually perform this project, and are they going to be able to do all this work in the time that they allot? And then we get into the kind of the technical elements. So, is the project additional? So, for this depends on the project type, but if you're planting trees, would the trees have been planted otherwise? So this is a big question that we have to try to figure out. And we do kind of have remote sensing tools for a lot of these problems. If you're protecting trees, are the trees really at risk? We look at the baseline. So what would have happened on this project if not for the project? And pretty much all carbon projects have a baseline of some sort. So, we can probably assume that no matter what you're doing, something might have happened, or at least we should ask whether something might have happened. We look at leakage. So how much carbon would have escaped? Well, I guess by protecting these trees or by doing this sort of action, are other trees being cut down because of that? So if these projects, for example, are taking timber off the market by protecting trees that have historically been commercially harvested, odds are the market is still going to want timber from somewhere. They may go to Brazil for that, for example. We look at the actual carbon stock. So we call this verification, but we're looking at like the actual carbon numbers and the detailed accounting of that. If there's growth and yield equations involved, we'll look at the outcomes of the rate at which trees are growing. We look at the monitoring. So I think this is a key point that we often spend a lot of time focusing on, which is that most of these projects are self-monitored. So project developers submit their own monitoring reports and create their own remote sensing models to say how much deforestation there's been. And of course, this has been a problem in the past. So we're looking to see if it's done. We look at how long the project is. We try to figure out what the 100-year value of the project is, even if it's like a 30-year project. And then most importantly, we look at, I guess, co-benefits, but it's really more about equity and justice. We want to know whether or not the right people are being paid. We want to know, we try to break down the revenue stream of the project. We try to break down and see what percentage of the project's revenue is going to direct payments or infrastructure benefits for the community, like a water treatment plant, or just PR fluff, like a beekeeping course. And then I guess also biodiversity is another element that we look at. So I think I managed to rattle off all 10 or 11 of them.
But I have a specific question about the local communities, because as we see it a lot recently, we see about also locations about projects that we kind of like get alerts that these locations, projects may not be very good for local communities. And, this probably drops the ratings. So I would like to know if location is also something you take care of, and how you can actually verify that local communities are getting involved or they actually benefit from the project.
Yeah, this is the trickiest thing for ourself and for any ratings agency to actually verify. We are somewhat constrained to what's written in the project documentation, which is unfortunate. And if there's not sufficient stuff written in the project documentation, then that warrants a low score. There have been occasions when we've gone out and actually tried to ask communities, and we can do that in some instances, but in a lot of other instances, these projects are just so remote and they could be dangerous areas, for example, in that it's relatively risky to send field crews to go and ask people. And I think there's often also a gatekeeping problem that we have with developers. I think some of our competing ratings agencies, they'll let developers introduce them to community members, and the community members who are being introduced, of course, have nothing but glowing things to say about the project because they're usually the ones that are profiting from it. But truly, what you need is independent verification, either on the ground or like by direct connection, by like phone call or something. And that's really tricky. I mean, a lot of there's been instances, for example, of project developers calling the police on people who have gone and tried to interview these communities and bribing the police essentially to arrest them. Yeah, there's been a lot of bad behavior, I guess. So this is the number one challenge that we face. And Renoster itself, I think we've had to change our ratings on like maybe 4 or 5 projects at this point. And every time it's not been about the carbon, it's been about the communities. And I guess, another another brutal fact is that as a ratings agency, we don't make that much money. These are often projects that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but the overhead to rate them is usually less than, tens of thousands at best. And so we generally can't do that much diligence. And we always offer to our customers that we'll go the extra mile if you want to pay for it. But
Right.
relatively few people have actually taken us up on it to really interview communities on the ground and see what's going on.
And how do you think this can be solved in the future?
Well, again, I think that verifiers are not doing a great job of actually assessing this right now because of the conflicts. I also think that part of the verification process of any project in which human beings live inside of it should be kind of open public interviews of randomly conducted by
Right.
verifiers on the ground. And those should be basically posted as maybe audio files or something on the website. And these interviews should be conducted on a fairly regular basis with each verification. And it should be just kind of like drawing names out of a hat and saying, okay, now we go to this door and we interview them about how they think about the project. I also think the number one thing that could fix this is public budgets. It blows my mind that budgets are not required to be made public in the carbon markets today, and
Oh,
very
wow.
few projects actually do. I think I only know of like 3 or 4. And so we really don't know where the money ends up going in these projects. And if a budget was made public that said, 60% of the revenue went to community benefits, and here are the names, that would be great.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite projects actually involves 180,000 small farmers. It's the TIST program. And it actually has Excel files, like MS Excel files, with 180,000 names in them, and the annual payments and how many trees they planted, and it's all clear as day. And it's beautiful to see as a diligence firm. So it could be
But
done. Yeah.
probably this has to be regulated for someone else. Like probably even Vera has a word on that and actually demand that when a project has to be registered to have these public files, because then this is going to increase in transparency. Then everybody will know how this money is spent and if the local communities are getting benefited. And then your work also is going to be easier, let's say, and verifiers' work is going to be easier also.
Yeah, that's exactly right. At the swish of a pen, Vera could create a set of rules that were really, really good. One of them would be making budgets public. One of them would be 50% of the revenue must go to communities on the ground. Another, so that's where the key lies. Or if not Vera, then like some higher regulatory power
Right.
like the ICPCM. Yeah.
What else would you think we need as policies right now to carbon markets? You mentioned a few, but I would like to go a bit deeper there.
Oh, geez. I guess that's a fairly broad question. I think that we just need to. I don't know. I've talked a lot about conflicts of interest. I think we just need to manage those very carefully, and
Okay.
I think with just a relatively few changes, like making every single element of a project transparent and changing who gets paid and changing who's doing the actual work, like who's making the maps and whatnot, we can fix most of the problems in the carbon markets.
Okay.
I mean, I could spend an hour going into like the nitty gritty flaws of the Abacus label or something, but yeah, I mean, I think at a higher level, like if you fix those things, the problems will kind of solve themselves. And I think
Okay.
that a lot of the carbon markets today have been limited by the attitude of the carbon markets, which has been very closed door and I guess defensive. And, I'll be honest, this is Vera's fault because Vera has historically considered project developers to be their number one stakeholders. So they don't consider, climate scientists to be their stakeholders or like the people inside the projects to be their stakeholders. I mean, they'd say they would. But when they do stakeholder consultations, it's project developers who are weighing in
Right.
on how Vera's system should work. And, historically speaking, Vera has communicated fairly improperly with project developers, kind of warning them that like scandals are about to break and whatnot. And it's created this industry that is very insular and very unwilling to make big changes or accept critiques. And we just have to step back and think of this not in terms of like a commodities market, but in terms of a scientific program in which
Right.
our goal is to critique ourselves. And our goal is to find flaws in what we're doing. And, as any scientist will tell you, that when you're trying to experiment and test a hypothesis, what you're trying to do is disprove that hypothesis. And so what we should be doing is trying to find as many problems in the market as possible so that we can fix them. And I think that that's definitely historically not been the case, because I think that the markets have been very quick to blacklist people who have been critical of them. And they've been very quick to ban reporters from market events. And this has just resulted in ugly outcomes in which everybody doubts the veracity of their credits. Anyway.
And how you feel it's gonna go? Like, how you feel in 10, 5 years carbon markets are gonna go? What is your hypothesis here also? Because we see a lot of ups and downs. Yeah, we see so many ups and downs that it's so hard to predict how the carbon markets are gonna go. Because if we fix them and we get them inside net zero more and more, then it's gonna be a great solution, and then we're gonna figure it out that way. However, are we gonna fix them? So it's always this question about how you see carbon markets like 5 years, not even 5, 3 years even.
I do not know. Because I mean, there are so many players who are trying to fix them, but then the industry itself has been very resistant to major changes. So,
Right.
Vera has not made like the programmatic level changes that I think they'd need to make. They have released a bunch of new protocols and labels, but they kind of still have the same like set of problems underlying them. In that, in any protocol, be it the consolidated framework or the Advocacy label, if I, as a forest scientist, wanted to go in and double the number of credits that I could get, I could do that. That would be fairly easy for me to do. So,
Yeah, that says a lot. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I don't think that they're there yet, but at the same time, there's so there's more startups doing really cool stuff than ever before. So I mentioned Open
Right.
Forest Protocol. There's the Ecosystem Restoration Standard. I mean, there's just dozens of these startups that are looking to do things really, really well, including Orbify, I would say. And I think that is a real strong mechanism for change if people are willing to kind of look at what these startups are doing and put their money behind that.
Right.
One of the big problems, of course, today on the market is that it is basically a monopoly. I mean, Vera isn't the only registry, but in many individual instances, they are the only registry for a particular project type and location. And so we have to kind of convince this monopoly to do better. And the best way of doing that is massive amounts of social and financial pressure. And I think that that's been happening. I think Vera has been under enormous pressure because their credits aren't selling for what they used to be, because they're just constantly getting bashed on by scientists and reporters. So yeah, I think that there is a pathway forward in the current market for it to get better. I always encourage people who are buying credits, do your diligence. There are really, really good carbon credits on the market today, and be open to accepting credits from kind of offbeat groups who are not the big players you're getting wined and dined by at the industry conferences, right? Like, be open to accepting like an ecosystem restoration credit rather than a Vera credit. And that's going to be one of the biggest ways that we can push the industry towards reform. I don't think carbon credits are going anywhere. I think that enough companies have made net zero commitments. And again, being a deep cynic, I don't think that companies are just going to reduce their emissions by 80% overnight. That they're still going to have to rely on offsets, whether they like it or not. And I think another big mechanism for change is companies need to get together and demand quality. And we're starting to see this. We saw this. This is the impetus behind the Advocacy label, and this is the impetus behind the Symbiosis Coalition, where big carbon credit purchasers are getting together and saying, Vera, you need to do a better job, or we're not going to buy your credits. And I think that this is another mechanism that gives me hope for the carbon markets in the next 3 to 5 years.
And how you feel that Amazon collaborated with Vera and they created, I think, their own carbon market, if I'm not mistaken? I don't remember the name right now. And I was seeing something like that in the news recently.
Well, Advocacy is what is their big push.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I think we need the buyers to have a much louder voice in this market, because so far they've kind of just been spoon-fed whatever the industry gives them. But I mean, one of my deepest questions in this market today is, why on earth hasn't South Pole or Vera been sued for creating credits that they knew weren't any good? Like we know from the internal communications at South Pole that for years they were printing credits that they knew weren't any good. why isn't, like, this is one of the best mechanisms of the free market to ensure that
Right.
people behave. And I think the answer to that is that these companies that were kind of duped by these groups are just kind of embarrassed and they don't want to like litigate this out. But I think that, even if they're not willing to turn to litigation, they seem more and more willing to turn to, I guess, consumer
Reporters.
collectives that are pushing
Yeah.
for reform.
Or even reporters. I see so many like newsletters and news right now about carbon markets really pushing through that. And this is very interesting also to see newspapers actually are going for carbon markets and which are going kind of like against them. And I see like this division very clearly, which is very interesting to me, honestly. But yeah, this is another topic probably.
As one of the bigger critics in the industry, I know most of the reporters at these
Yeah.
newspapers who are kind of against them. And I think if you were to talk to any of them, Ben Elgin, Patrick Greenfield, they all want carbon markets to work in some way,
Yeah.
and they don't want to be doing this reporting. They don't want their whole life to be consumed by carbon market babysitting. And so I think that if the markets were truly fixed, you would not see them consider.
I wouldn't see this. Yeah, I wouldn't see this post. Yeah. But also it's kind of interesting how it felt to me that somehow we're waiting for this post in order to focus, on the carbon markets and the flows, because at least in my perspective and in my surroundings, nobody was really talking about that. And then this post came and everybody switched and went to carbon markets and realized the issues and the flows. Before, nobody was really talking about them, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a major reason why, like, personally, I turned to advocacy in, I guess, like 2021, because I didn't see the mechanisms for change internally. And at this carbon broker that I worked at, I was in endless calls with Vera, with like their chief innovation officer and stuff. And I didn't see like any real pushes for major changes. And so people often criticize reporters a lot for being mean to the carbon industry, but I think they are the only reason that the industry is getting better right now. And you really have to credit them for that. I think that, well, in my opinion, and this is a more controversial opinion, I think one of the criticisms that I get often is that even if we're not doing everything perfectly, it's better that we do something than nothing, right? And that we could envision a world where carbon markets collapse and nothing is done and everything's worse. But I really don't think that that's the right philosophy, because I think, for one thing, what Vera has done with its program is put an artificial price on restoration and conservation that is way, way lower than the actual cost. So everyone knows generally, like, restoring an ecosystem usually costs, at least $30 to $60 a ton. Conserving an ecosystem about the same if you're actually trying to compete with the timber prices. And so Vera comes along and creates infinite numbers of credits that really never sold for anywhere near that price. At best, they were selling for $12 a ton. And conservation across the entire world becomes more difficult. Even if you're not participating in the carbon markets, you have to now compete, and you have to go out as a nonprofit and say, I need to conserve this forest, but it's going to cost more than $30 a ton. And now you have to collect money when your donors are looking at the carbon market and saying, well, they're doing it for only 10.
Yeah,
so,
it's only 10 there, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical that we fix the markets, because I think that they are really holding back like the conservation and the restoration that needs to be done across the entire world. So that's kind of my personal motivations towards turning towards advocacy, in addition to, or a little bit before the Guardian article came out, was that I something needs to be done, and as a climate scientist, everyone should be up in arms in this market. So yeah.
And I would like to kind of, before closing, I would like to go to the conclusions part, and I would like to have your conclusive thoughts and ideas about carbon markets, and something you really want to share with the audience, and something to close the podcast with your, I don't know, main inspiration and hopes.
I think I gave away all the good stuff already, but I mean, I guess I would say that we see more actors trying to do good now than we've ever seen before as a ratings agency. So we are rating like dozens of these projects. I don't know, maybe not a month, but we are rating a lot of these projects, and we see more good behavior and more people trying to do everything right than we've ever seen. And we especially see that from a lot of really small, clever organizations that are kind of rethinking how to do things. And I encourage everybody to look into those groups and consider what they're offering. And I think that we still have a big problem in the market, but there's more awareness than ever before. So
Right.
we're no longer in a place where people just sign off on whatever credits that they come by. And that is a really powerful tool for fixing the markets and getting people to buy really high quality credits. I guess one thing that I've often considered is that the market is shrinking right now because of the quality crisis. No
Right.
doubt about that. I mean, it's like half the size it was like 2 years ago or something like that. But even if the market shrinks to a quarter of the size it was, in 2019, if that quarter is nothing but high quality credits, we'll be doing more for the climate than we were before. So
Definitely. Yeah.
that's really what we have to consider, is that even if people are scared away a little bit, those that are left behind are going to be left on kind of the islands, like the best quality credits on the market are going to go to them. And so I think that we kind of have to take our licks a little bit and do our best to speak out and fix things, and everything will work out. So
That's great. Thank you so much.
yeah,
And I
thanks
would
for
like
having me.
also to ask you if you can share with me where we can find you, where the audience can find you. Maybe you can share with your contact information or your company name again, or something that you would like to share, or any events you're going to go, or any blog post you want to share, or any information about how to actually find you more.
Yeah, so my company's name is Renoster, and if you're looking for diligence into a carbon project that you're looking to invest in, we encourage it. Uh, I my personal LinkedIn account. Well, I guess personally, LinkedIn is generally the best way to reach me. I'm very chatty on there. We have a number of cool blog posts that we've posted about the carbon markets and about like which credits are doing great and which ones aren't. Um, I'm happy to share my email. My email is just elias@renoster.co. Uh, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to reach out to me. I always accept meetings. So
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. That was amazing. Thank you for all the insights. I really cannot wait to actually hear again this podcast because of all this valuable information that you told me. And thank you so much for being here with us.
yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.